Hey everybody, welcome back to the next video in our series. Last time we were talking about your personal budget, and today we're talking about the project's budget. So this is going to be a fun one because obviously you have some money now and you want to buy a property, but you need to know how to budget for that property in order to make it a success.
Exactly. Yeah, huge part.
Let's talk about capital stack.
Sure. So capital stack is a term that real estate people throw around. It's just a fancy word for your overall budget and the various components, the type of funding that are going to make up that budget in its entirety.
Alrighty. So let's say we're touring the house. We need to determine a scope for the project. We need to start thinking about construction costs, getting estimates, that sort of thing. We lost our lighting. It's broad daylight. We're just gonna
Roll
keep
with
going. So let's start talking about that. The difference between going in and determining the scope for yourself, and then also whether or not you can do the estimating yourself versus bringing in a contractor in.
Sure. So one of the first things that drives your scope is determining what you want the house to be at the end of the day when it's done, right? So if you want 3 bedrooms and 2 baths, and right now it's 3 bedrooms and 1 bath, you know part of the scope is adding that bathroom. In addition to that is going into the house, touring it, and seeing the condition of the property, right? So you walk in there and you're like, oof, this kitchen's a disaster. Part of the scope is going to be gutting that kitchen. And if you're like taking down walls to open it up, that's part of the scope. New flooring, paint, curb appeal, all those things would fall within scope. And I do recommend that you make a Word document. Lighting is back. That outlines what those are, and don't worry about it being in like construction terminology. You're going to go through it with your contractor anyway so that they understand what it is, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, and another thing to take into account is anything that is a safety item or a structure item, you're really going to have to consider doing, other than like what does somebody want in that neighborhood. At that price point. So if you want to sell in a certain neighborhood at a certain price point, there are certain finish levels you're going to obviously take into account, but you always need to take into account systems, safety, structure. So let's talk a little bit about construction costs and how you determine where the project is too expensive. You know, because obviously you can spend whatever you want on a house. You can do any kind of upgrades you want. You can always add massive additions, but at some point it would no longer be cost effective. Do we want to touch a little bit on how we determine whether or not the cost is?
Absolutely, right? So you're going to take a look at a basic math calculation. It's really subtraction and addition, nothing crazy. We're not going to get into like multiple variables or anything like that.
Multivariate calculus is next on your list of things to learn.
Yay! So you're going to start with what you think the sort of max value of that property could be once you've got it in the condition that you want, like the number of bedrooms and bathrooms that you're going to want. But there's going to be an upper echelon maximum for that neighborhood, that geographic location. And once you have that number, you've developed it probably in conjunction with your real estate agent through a lot of different analysis into the neighborhood information. You would then back off the cost of the house, the cost of the construction for the house, your transaction costs. So that would be your closing costs. When you're buying, you generally don't pay the realtor, but sometimes you do. So factoring that in, and then any loan costs associated with the project.
Right. So obviously, if all of those costs exceed what you could sell it for, it would definitely be a no-go, but you're also going to need to want to set a threshold for how much profit you want to make and how much sort of wiggle room you're going to put in there. So
that's different based on what you're going to do with the house. So if it's a flip, obviously you need that gap to be available immediately. If it's a buy and hold, you're really thinking about long-term how much of a gap you need, and you may not in the short term have a big problem with the fact that you're only going to have, let's say, $10,000 worth of equity in the house, because when you take a look at your carry costs and your support of the property, the cost of that, your rent is so much higher that you're like, but I clear based on my rent and I will eventually make up the equity because this is a 10-year hold for me. Theoretically, you want both the house to have a lot of equity in it and a good rental rate, but sometimes you're picking one or the other as a priority. And so it depends on what your plan is for the property.
Speaking of gaps, we should probably also mention here contingency planning.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say if you're new to this type of project, this type of work, you're going to want a pretty hefty contingency. I personally hold a 10% contingency on my soft costs. So that is my permit fees, my architect fees, my engineering fees, any sort of civil site work that I'm getting done, my utility fees, all that stuff. I hold a 10% contingency on that. And then I also hold a 10% contingency on my construction costs. And then, down the line. So, and then if it were a flip, I would also hold a contingency on what I think my transaction costs are eventually going to be when I get out of it. Probably wouldn't be 10%, that's really high, but probably 5% on some of those other costs that just aren't locked in until you sell the property.
Right. All right, so another important point is going to be doing your due diligence.
So due diligence is actually something that would happen oftentimes before you put a contract on a house, but sometimes, you have to put a contract in quickly and you would do that before you close. And you probably want to do it before all of your contingencies expire in case you find out some information and you need to get out of the deal. But due diligence costs are generally over and above your budget. Now you should obviously account for that with your own math, but in a project budget, it's usually not included unless it's like, say, a commercial project in which you're going to have really hefty due diligence expenses. So one of the due diligence expenses would be checking the survey and making sure that you don't have any, basically
Easements.
fences or you don't have any structures that are like intruding upon easements or property boundaries or anything like that. Making sure that if there's an addition or there was a substantial renovation that somebody pulled permits on that would be due diligence.
Protected land,
possibly talking to your land use attorney if there's an issue. Like when we bought our house, it's terraced and there are a bunch of retaining walls and one of multiple were failing, but the big one that was failing was in the back. And so I did due diligence talking to the land use attorney about whose wall is that? How does the law figure that out? And then how would I go about fixing it if I decided that it was mine? So those are some of the expenses associated with due diligence on the property before you purchase. Condos, that's due diligence. Figuring out if it's a healthy condo.
Are you allowed to rent?
Yes. Do you have any parking restrictions? Do you have any special taxes? Do you have any special assessments? All of these things that might not be disclosed by the seller, but that you would ultimately be responsible for. Because once you sign on the dotted line, you can try to take them to court, but it's going to be tough.
Right. Yeah. And so let's say that we've outlined now, we're making a big assumption. That's a lot of work right there to actually draft your spreadsheet of costs. But let's say we've done that. The next step would be looking at your equity.
Yeah.
And setting a budget number for that, what you have access to.
Right. So once you have your total number, you know how much it's going to cost to buy and renovate and prep the property for whatever you're planning to do with it. That number is your budget. And then now you have to determine the capital stack. Where's all the source of funding coming from in order to make up that total cost? So the first thing would be your equity piece, which is generally the capital, the cash that you are bringing to the table in order to purchase the property. And that is often dependent on what the requirements of the loan are. Some loans require 20%, some loans require 5%, it depends. The next component of that would be the loan. So generally with a residential property, those are really the two main portions of the capital stack. So then in addition to your debt and your equity, over and above that is usually transaction costs. And those are made up of
your closing costs and your realtor fees.
Right.
So your closing costs are going to include everything from loan costs to, which we just outlined separately, to taxes, to if it's a condo,
water fees, condo fees,
insurance,
real estate taxes, transfer taxes, insurance, the whole bunch of things. And they're usually 2.5%,
3%, depending
of the
on
value of the
jurisdiction.
Property. Your real estate agent should be able to give you some guidance in order to estimate that. But also a big trick that's really, really helpful is if you've picked your title company, you've put in an offer, or you have a good relationship with them and you're considering putting in an offer, you can often contact them and ask them to run an estimate closing disclosure or an estimate closing document for you that would outline what those fees would be. If you're shopping title companies, you probably want to ask for, based on a theoretical $500,000 house, what would all of your fees be? And they'll tell you what their fees are so that you can determine if they're the best title company from a cost comparison. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the best title company, because service is incredibly important with your title company. But it's another way to measure them.
Right. And the jurisdiction that you're in is going to make a difference. Closing costs are cheaper in DC than in Maryland, for instance.
But your title company would know exactly what those percentages are and be able to calculate them perfectly for you, rather than you having to dig around in their legislative information and figure it out.
Right. And then, of course, realtor fees are going to vary. On some projects, when you're purchasing, you may have to pay your real estate agent.
Apologies. The dog has an opinion about the mailman.
Yeah, the mailman is very suspicious.
Not allowed.
For your realtor, you may be paying your real estate agent, but you may not be. It depends on the buy side on what the situation is. If you're buying from just like a homeowner, typically the seller pays both sides, but it may not be the case, especially if you're buying a bank-owned property.
Or it's an estate sale. They might have some special parameters.
Or for sale by owner.
For sale by owner, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
auction.
Mm-hmm. There are some times where you might want to factor in an amount for your realtor fees. And then, of course, you are going to want to take into consideration when you're looking at your after number, you also need to think about the transaction costs, the closing costs, and the realtor fees for your after, because you will be paying your real estate agent and the buyer's agent in your after, and you will have those fees again that you just paid. So you have to factor both of those things in.
Yeah, exactly. And the one thing I would say is you might be tempted, if you realize that you're going to be paying some portion of the fees for your real estate agent, to try to complete a transaction without a real estate agent. I really do not suggest that. They do a tremendous amount of work, and they provide a level of professional advice and advising that you will not be able to replicate by yourself. Mm-hmm. I've bought a lot of properties in a lot of areas that I know pretty well. I would still never consider going through a transaction, even if I had to pay my real estate agent without a real estate agent.
Mm-hmm. There's always new legislation, new contingencies.
Just
rules.
The forms.
Mm-hmm.
The forms alone. I mean, if you haven't bought a house, like the contract alone is lengthy and complicated, and your real estate agent will know the ins and outs and every single question you could have about that document. And without them, you would basically have to pay an attorney, who's going to be more expensive than your real estate agent, to figure all that stuff out, or wing it. And don't wing it.
Don't wing it.
Don't wing it.
So I think that's sort of like a good outline for today. Any other things you want to hit before we close out?
No, I don't think so. An important thing in this entire process would be, when you're going through, make sure you document everything, write it down, make sure you understand who told you what when, so that you can reference that in the future. Don't just try to remember all this stuff in your mind. It's not going to work. And then, 3 years later, after you've bought the property, you're going to be like, wait, what did they say? I need to do something right now, and then I get money back or something. You write it down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also do a real budget and a real thing. Learn how to use Excel. It's not complicated to add and subtract in Excel.
Can I post an Excel file
to this?
Yeah.
I could do a screenshot of it.
Okay, so what we'll do too is we'll just take a quick screenshot of one of my basic templates, so that you guys can see what that looks like, and it gives you a jumping off point.
And right now it's right here over my face.
So yeah, so that gives you the basics. If you're buying, it's probably going to be a flip model, but you can easily make adjustments to that if there's an income component, carrying costs.
Yeah, you'll get better at estimating things and learning things in the beginning. Be conservative with your numbers.
Yeah.
Overestimate expenses, underestimate profits and revenues that you're going to make, and that way you, if the profit number still looks good to you, because you have to figure out how long is this project going to be, how much money do I want to make in that time, because I'm not doing other things during that time. Which you may be in the future, but in the beginning, you're going to be doing one project at a time. You're not going to be doing multiple flips at a time. So you're going to want to be able to take all of that into account. What's the amount of money I need to have made on this? Yeah.
And then you have to determine if that divided by the amount of time it's going to take you is actually worth your time, right? Everybody's like, oh, $15,000 would be great. So $15,000 in 2 months, that is great. $15,000 in 10 months, not so great. So just keep that in mind. Your time is valuable.
Right.
And you need to make that decision as best you can. But yeah, be very conservative with your numbers. Even after you're experienced, be conservative with your numbers. I mean, COVID's a great example of this. If you weren't conservative with your numbers because the market was going up and everything looked amazing for such a long time, that's when you get caught in a circumstance where you bought something that now the market has dropped by 5% and you're like, I can't get out of this for the amount of money and I'm going to have to take a loss.
Right.
It happens.
Right.
And you'll recover. Everything will eventually be fine. But the way to avoid that is to be very conservative.
Right. Which, you know, in September, we didn't see March being the March that it was. So if you were under construction with the March delivery date, your whole world changed.
Yeah, in a big way.
So, alrighty. Well, to end on that really positive note, we are going to be back next time to talk a little bit more about loans, the structure of loans, types of loans that you can do, and then we're also going to have a follow-up to that where we're going to have some lenders come in and talk to you about more traditional style loans and hard money loans and sort of get some true finance lender style advice.
Professional.
The professionals are going to come in and tell us how it's really going to be in a case of actually looking for that loan. What's the product you need? What's the down payment you need? What are the factors you should take into consideration?
Yep. Awesome. Thanks, guys, for joining us.
If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so that you can be notified about the next one.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.